Maybe we could start with a kind of a background sketch on you, including what motivates you.
Okay. Well, probably a big part of the reason for my interest in cross-linguistic studies is the fact that I come from a sort of a multilingual background myself, and for many years I operated in, I worked in sort of multi-language sort of environment.
Mm-hmm.
So my mother tongue is Czech, but I grew up in Montreal, which, as you probably know, is a bilingual city. So I had to learn to speak French, but I was mainly educated in English. So anyway, so you know, multiple languages have sort of always been in the picture.
Was there some aspect of the multilingualism that intrigued you as you interplayed across the languages?
Definitely, yes. So I've always had an interest in languages in any case. So I studied modern languages when I was in school, and then I got a degree in education, and then I worked as a remedial teacher. Actually, my first career was as a remedial teacher in primary schools in some English suburbs of Montreal. And again, I found myself teaching in a French school, but that catered almost exclusively to English-speaking kids, or to the children who were referred to as allophones, so they didn't speak either English or French as their first language. So I was teaching children who had difficulties, and these were usually reading difficulties, but who were functioning not in their native language. So yes, that's sort of professionally and personally, there's always been that aspect that I've had to deal with, and I'm interested in it sort of naturally anyways. So the milieu I found myself in was sort of conducive to my later interests in the research aspect of how children learn to read in different languages and across languages and so on.
Excellent. So it sounds like your early development established a kind of trajectory that the more you got into it, folded back on itself in a way to be researching what was interesting to you all along. Yeah?
Yes. Although it didn't always happen. You know, it wasn't always planned. So I ended up being a remedial teacher. Not because I trained to be one, but because there was a sudden opening at a school, you know, when I was looking for work, and was convinced that I was probably skilled enough to take this on. But anyway, a lot of it was learning on the job. But somehow, you know, coincidence and, background factors always came together in a positive way.
And it's interesting, I'll bet the coincidences, that they seem like coincidences, and certainly they are at one level, that teaching the remedial kids definitely informs how you think about this, doesn't it?
Oh, very much, yes.
So even though it seemed like it was a bit of a segue, turns out to be, you know, just part of the foundation that you needed to do what you do.
Yes.
It's interesting how that works, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, so that's it. And that was the start of my career, really, and I became interested in, I tried to understand what was wrong with these kids who couldn't learn to read, or definitely not as easily as their peers. And at the time in Quebec, but probably in most of Canada, there was a big sort of embracing of the whole language philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was sort of learning on the job, and I was attending workshops and following instructions of educational psychologists, and was trying to remediate these kids with a lot of whole language type strategies, you know, whole word reading and language experience and this sort of thing. But it wasn't terribly effective, and not least because, again, these kids were expected to be generating stories, for example, in a language that they barely mastered. You know, they had real difficulties not only in reading, but of course in acquiring this foreign language as well. And then eventually, one year, I went to a conference, a special education conference, and Lynette Bradley was presenting there, and probably you know her name, of Bryant and Bradley fame. They were the authors of some seminal big studies here in the UK, looking at the effects of phonological awareness training, both on just normal development, but also on remediating children who had reading delay.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to her presentation, and she was reporting some of these findings on the beneficial effects of training phonological skills and letter-sound correspondences, along with these skills on children's progress in reading. And it was a real eye-opener on the one hand, and on the other hand, it seemed finally that something was making complete sense to me. It seemed a completely logical sort of insight. So I went away from that and started trying to implement that in the classroom with these kids. So that's, I don't want to go on too long about this.
No, so this is a pivotal point where the oral language foundation, it becomes really clear that reading sitting on top of it, and that you can improve the takeoff into reading by improving the foundation.
Definitely, yes.
It's kind of amazing that anybody could ever think otherwise when you look back on it, huh?
Yes, quite, yeah. And I think probably, to be fair, the experts, who were propounding whole language for even these kids in these remedial, they weren't actually in separate classrooms, they were taken out of the mainstream, but who were coming into this remedial sort of program. I guess they couldn't, people who didn't speak more than, or didn't experience trying to learn a skill in a second language when really you've got fundamental problems in language in general, that trying to do it top down from these larger, broader language skills and hoping that something about print would just be, tacked onto that. That just was never going to work exactly.
Clearly human beings are meaning-seeking, and the more meaningful something is, the more that it engages us and allows us to process our way into greater clarity with it. But, that's one thing in a natural situation. It's an entirely different thing in a contrived technological environment like, writing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
Where you need to learn the skill in order to actually get at the meaning.
Yeah. So I've always had an appreciation for the kind of spirit intent of whole language with its meaning centricity, and also been just flabbergasted that they could ever think that it was natural enough to apply that analog.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes, quite. I agree. Yes, and I think especially in these second language kinds of contexts, I think
that would certainly make it more vivid.
A lot of kids.
Yeah. Good. So from this direct experience of kids struggling in multiple language environments and seeing the shortcomings of whole language firsthand while perhaps appreciating it, that set the backdrop for your listening readiness to hear about the phonological underpinnings, and that when that happened, it really kind of lined things up. That was an insight that gave you new ground to go from.
Yes, definitely. And also the time that, around which I went to this conference, I was beginning to consider anyways going back to school and doing a master's and somehow pursuing, finding out why really these kids are having the kinds of difficulties they have. I was really intrigued. And at the same time, I was beginning to be a bit disillusioned about, the system and the expectations and the fact that, the conditions were never the ideal ones for remediation anyway. And so it was just the timing was right, yes, for me to attend that conference and to sort of spur me on. And so I did go back and applied for a master's degree and pursued that interest in my master's thesis. So I went to work with Maggie Brooke, who was in Montreal at the time, and who was a prominent figure in the field of reading development. She's no longer working in the field, but anyways, and so with her, and my original idea was to do some study on bilingual children with reading difficulties and phonological awareness, and how will that help them. And she just said, well, the problem is that we don't really know enough about dyslexia in second language learners and about about phonological awareness in languages other than English, because most of the work at that point had been carried out in English.
Mm-hmm.
So we decided on a sort of more straightforward and simpler question, and so that's how I got into just straight cross-linguistic studies, but comparing monolingual speakers of each language. And my first project was to compare the phonological awareness skills of Czech children and English-speaking children, and to look at whether both the language structure as well as the orthography would have some sort of specific effect on the development of these skills in the speakers of these different languages.
Which would lead off into the phonotactic direction.
Yes, that's remained very much an interest of mine. I'm very interested, of course, in the effects of the orthography on reading and spelling and processing print and so on, but a real other interest of mine is looking at, moreover, in addition to orthography, what does the language itself do to children's developing phonological skills, and does it influence how readily then they can begin to learn mappings between letters and sounds or larger units and so on.
Right. We tend to think of oral language as this kind of amorphous, fluid system, but it also has an analog to the orthography in that it has structures, like you're bringing out with the phonotactics, that change what's possible and what's not possible, and therefore implicitly is a structure. And you could say that there's a relationship between that structure and the structure in the orthography.
Definitely, yes.
And you've been operating on going back and forth, looking at how those interplay across languages.
Yes, that's right.
That's beautiful work. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
That's important. Yeah. So, so from your master's degree.
Mm-hmm. Well, the master's degree then was just following this hunch that maybe Czech children, because of the structure of their language, would have greater facility with some aspects of phonemic awareness than English children, and that this would be sort of over and above any effects of orthography on phonological awareness development. And that was confirmed. So my hunch was confirmed, and that was fine. And then I went on to do my Ph.D. also with Maggie Brooke, and in that study I compared French and English children on a slightly different aspect of phonology and early reading. And then when I finished that work, I got an opportunity to come to the UK to work in a lab in York with Maggie Snowling and Charles Hume. And there I started working on spelling. And, well, that was meant to be a 2-year stay, but it's almost 10 years, and here I am. And, and that was another sort of big piece of work that has also since informed my work. That was looking at spelling, well, really more than spelling. It was the main focus was on spelling development in English-speaking children, so that was strictly looking at one language group. But we were interested in looking at how really phonology and letternology foundation skills interact, how they affect spelling and reading, and then how reading and spelling influence each other and so on. In the development of, eventually, of conventional spelling skills. And I guess that has been a useful study in the sense that it convinced me and my colleagues anyway that really what English children do at the beginning is not so different from what children do when they're learning these more transparent orthographies, and I'm talking about alphabetic orthography.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That really the foundations are the same, and we've sort of confirmed that from subsequent studies as well with Czech children and now Slovak children. And, in that phonological awareness and letter knowledge are as important for learners of transparent orthographies as they are for kids learning English. But then what children do with those skills appears to be really quite similar in that the English children that we followed, learned associations between letters and sounds, these canonical associations. And then when they came to try to spell words, they applied that knowledge on a very sort of serial, sequential basis, and the extent to which that worked varied by the regularity of the word and so on. But the strategy was essentially a very phonological, sequential type of strategy where they were attempting.
Iteratively experimental?
With the children?
Yeah.
Yes. Do you mean in the sense that they would try to connect the first?
Right. They would go through a serial set of iterative approaches to experimentally getting the match.
Yes, more or less. Although in the earliest stages, of course, they were pretty happy with whatever they produced.
Right.
They weren't that aware of what the real match was or what the target really was supposed to look like. But yes, it was sort of a serial, more or less a serial process, and just retrieving whichever letters they could think of to correspond to the phonemes they were able to isolate in the word, and then putting that on paper. And eventually, over time, that little skeleton basically became more and more complete and more accurate. And really, it was only in the latest stages of our study, which spanned the first 3 years of schooling. But it was really only in the later stages that the additional, the real orthographic information that you couldn't strictly derive on phonemic segmentation and mapping, some canonical sound to or some canonical letter to. That kind of knowledge emerged really after they'd become able to represent this phonological skeleton of the word, basically.
Right.
So the idea being that they, with a few very high-frequency exceptions, what the English children were doing was really assembling spellings on the basis of just letter-sound associations that they had, that they knew.
Right, and then as in parallel, as their literacy learning picked up and their orthographic knowledge came in, that acted as an overlay to that skeleton to refine it further later on.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
So it was reading. So initially, all of their skills were sort of bottom-up, driven by phonological awareness, letter knowledge, and some kind of mapping skill.
Mm-hmm.
And as they're reading, but reading didn't really affect those early attempts, at least not statistically significantly. But as they became more proficient spellers, they also became more proficient decoders. And then eventually it was the decoding and the word recognition skills that started to impact on their ability to complete the orthographic representations, the spellings,
right,
according to English convention.
It's really interesting that there's such a radical difference between, there's the same code. We're going, encoding, decoding, in and out, but in the spelling process, there's the opportunity to consciously, volitionally participate
Yes.
And in the reading process, it has to happen automatically faster than they can consciously, volitionally participate in order for it to flow at the rate that is necessary. So it's like there's something very interesting about how reciprocal the relationship is, even though they're obviously happening in very different ways.
Yes, that's true. And in a sense, these processes are slightly asynchronous in that it seems that this very laborious, explicit, volitional phase that's required for beginning to spell seems to be really the starting point for rapid recognition, or so it seems to me, of words in print. And if that's not the only driving factor, that's certainly got to be one of the more important ones. You know, that once kids have that ability to really gain an insight into the full phonemic structure of a word and have some sort of representation of what the letters that might map onto that skill in itself really boosts their word recognition skills.
When they can generalize their approach to that includes that kind of differentiation, as opposed to it being idiosyncratic to a particular word.
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. So at the early stages, you're seeing that there's quite a parallel across the languages.
Yes. Well, and one of the questions that you asked me, you know, in the list you sent, was whether there were any disagreements or whether, you know, my findings were controversial in any way. And I'd say possibly that's one of the areas where it's certainly looking to me as though the foundations really are very similar. There are definitely differences in how literacy skills are acquired depending on whether you're learning, you know, Finnish or English. But I think the differences really underlyingly of the core sort of skills and mechanisms, definitely at the beginning, in the earliest stages, they seem pretty similar.
Yeah, I would think that's a natural. You know, that seems really clear. The problem happens when, how do you deal with the additional layers of confusion that come in as the depth of the you call it the depth of the orthography, and you know, for me it's just ambiguous relationships. And the processing overhead associated with disambiguating that, you know, the potential correspondences to the actual correspondences in the context of a word, and doing it fast enough that your brain's not stuttering beyond the ability to be staying in the flow of what it means. Yeah, so, but it does seem that to the extent, I guess you could make the argument that for deaf children, this isn't true, right? That they're not obviously not reading on top of sound in the same way.
Oh yes.
Right. But children who are normally speaking or inside the range of anywhere near normally speaking, reading's got to sit on top of it and cue that at least during the initial stages. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And that in itself would imply the common foundational elements of processing and correspondences that would then further differentiate as you got into the different phonological structures and their resonance or dissonance with the different orthographic structures. That kind of where you're at?
Yes, that's where I'm at. But I wouldn't say that's there's a complete consensus on that, although I think the consensus is kind of growing. But there was quite a bit of literature a few years ago suggesting that really if you're learning a transparent orthography, then maybe those foundation skills, and in particular phonological awareness, might really play a much lesser role in enabling you to begin to learn to read and write than if you're learning a system like English. So the argument was that, well, really, you mainly gain insight into the phonemic structure of words once you learn something about letters. You gain those letter representations. And if you're learning in a system where those correspondences between letters and sounds is highly predictable, then simply learning the letters of your alphabet and their corresponding sounds is enough to bootstrap you sort of into the whole system. So you don't really need that much phonological awareness a priori, prior to trying to learn to read.
I would think that that's masking something, though. That it isn't so much that you don't need that, but that in the more confusing orthographies, you need more powerful, robust processing abilities to be able to punch through the ambiguity before you run out of time. So right. So it's the robustness of the kind of core processing engine here that is more in demand as the orthographic correspondence confusion goes up. But that the basic elements on both sides is still a baseline foundation, like you've been describing, of the phonological development.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Yes, that the weighting might be different, and I think that is where the consensus is slowly heading. That there's some little differences in the relative weighting of the role of phonological awareness in a shallow versus a deep writing system. But that really, the core component skills are pretty well the same. Yeah.
Right. And the difference being that the robustness of those skills, the speed of those skills, the fluidity of those skills is required more in a complex orthography to pop through it.
I'm not so sure about that.
Okay, good. I'm putting it out there to push us around, I'm not sure that they're more important. Their evidence might be, they may be evident for longer periods of time because, there are other issues that have to do with how you measure things. And phonological awareness we tend to measure in terms of accuracy, right? How accurately kids can manipulate sublexical units. And in English, accuracy is also the measure that we tend to use for spelling, of course, but also for reading, even into adulthood. Whereas in these more transparent systems, kids tend to reach very high levels of accuracy in single word reading quite early on, and so you hit ceilings. So you can't really measure accuracy anymore, let's say beyond the end of grade 1 or the middle of grade 2. So what people start measuring in terms of reading is speed in transparent orthographies. And then they try to look at correlations between phonological awareness accuracy and reading speed. And those almost always turn out to be weaker in comparison to correlations between phonological awareness accuracy, say in English, and reading accuracy in English, of course. But if you use the same kind of metric in both languages, if you're doing a cross-linguistic comparison, you tend to find that actually those correlations are pretty similar. So I wouldn't say that in English the phonological awareness component is more important or longer lasting. It's just more evident in the kinds of measures that we typically use in English language research. But if you used sort of a more appropriate measure, let's say phonological awareness speed against reading speed,
you would find that those relationships are still there.
Right. Okay. So I appreciate your distinctions and recognize the difference between what we're trying to talk about, the kind of core underlying processes, but we're talking about them in the relatively narrow confines of how we test and measure them. Yeah, and that I guess what I was probing for was that it seems that the more powerful the underlying oral language dexterity in a child, the better able they are to negotiate the complexity in the orthography.
Yes, quite.
Right, and so that would give that difference might appear to weight the phonological measures that we do have more on English back where we were a few minutes ago, which is an abstract slice of that.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. It's amazing to me I've had a conversation with some of the people that are working in the neuroscience of phonology, and they talk about the quality of phonological representations and how fuzzy phonological representations can result in lag times in the phonological assembly process that underlies word recognition. And yet, to the exact same extent that there's time associated with processing fuzzy phonological representations, there's time associated with processing fuzzy correspondences. Okay. Right, between those letters and sounds. And there seems to be a direct correspondence between the hesitation, start, stop, stutter in the articulation of a struggling reader and the particular area of the code and the letter sound correspondence confusions that their brain's processing through. Okay. Which is my entry into the whole orthographic depth hypothesis space. What interests me is we've got, at least in the U.S., the people that I talk to, we've got scientists drilling deep into the phonological dimensions of all this and saying how time critical all that processing is, but seem to have very shallow attention on the processing time implications of the confusion in the orthography.
Yeah, I don't know the extent to which people have looked at whether you get differences sort of within language. So within a language like English, in processing highly regular word versus completely exceptional spelling of a word. I guess that also depends on what population people are doing these kinds of studies with. Of course, if you're doing it with adults who have mastered reading, those kinds of differences might be smaller than if you were to do the same thing with a young reader. Yes, and I guess what you would expect would be, the greater the inconsistency and the unpredictability, then that would compound processing time all the more. Yes. Yes.
In fact, because the kinds of confusions that have to be processed through don't have implicit natural relationships that are analogs to the oral language. Right? So I mean, it's an artificial disambiguation comparatively. Anyway, that was kind of a clumsy way to segue into the next space of our conversation, but I'm really interested in what your work, grounded in the oral dimension and in the orthographic dimension, and having had first-person experience yourself of being with struggling readers and then research large populations, what you've teased out, what you found, what insights you've gained from the research that you've conducted across languages that shed a light on the role of orthography in the challenge of reading.
Well, I guess probably the clearest finding that's come out of the various studies, and that's very consistent with the work of other people doing cross-linguistic comparisons, is that there definitely is this significant effect on rate. So orthographic depth definitely influences the rate at which children do learn the code. And those early skills, both in word recognition, in the basics of spelling, and then of course that has knock-on effects to just higher level skills. So that seems to be a very strong and consistent result. Another finding that's more particular to my work is this idea of the role of the component skills. And so basically across various projects I've found that really when you measure things in comparable ways, and you use populations that are comparable across cultures and languages, what children do when they're attempting to read and spell words relies fundamentally on the same set of core component skills. I guess the other sort of finding from my work is that the relationship between spelling and reading seems to be similar, and that really a very critical skill, regardless of the type of language you're learning to read, is to be able to represent it yourself, to spell, to begin to spell, and that's really an important first step into using the system in some sort of functional way.
Participation in the spelling has this tickling trickle that affects everything else.
Yes. Yeah.
And that there's a symmetry, even though the level of confusion's different or work involved is different across the different orthographies. There's still a relationship between spelling and reading that's, although it's varying across each of the orthographies, it's a constant across all orthographies. Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's it's an important point in the sense that, you know, reading researchers really do focus very often, almost exclusively, on the development of reading skills, and then of course they take into account some of these underlying cognitive skills that have to come into play, but don't often look at the interplay between the other, you know, the other skill that is definitely a part of it, which is spelling, and yet, you know, spelling is in some senses a more difficult skill to learn, and maybe more revealing about what kinds of underlying skills are influencing the acquisition. It's more of a window on processing, because it's really a production process. So when children are having difficulties, you can gain insights into what's causing that difficulty through error patterns in their spelling.
Right. It's allowing you to peer into their process and how that is they're relating sound and letters in a slow speed way you can get a handle on, where it's all kind of fused together in reading, and you can't peer into those distinctions in the same way.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and not only
sense.
at the phonological level, but of course at the morphological level as well. You can begin to start to understand how deep is their understanding of the structure of the language they use. Yeah. So, yes, I would say that those are really the main findings so far, and that I'd say that what kids default to across all systems, well, all alphabetic systems anyway, is really some kind of phonological strategy and some attempt to begin to construct phonological, orthographic representations on the backs of their developing phonological representations.
Right. But and there's a difference that comes in, it would seem, in that I mean, kids, it's really easy to associate a word and a sound with an object. Right? Kids don't have problems with that. But when a visual representation has a number of possible sound representations, and the particular correct one or right one is contextually dependent on the field, in this case the word, and they have to work it out fast enough for the resulting word recognition system to fire inside of their attention span of paying attention to working out a word. That's another level of complexity beyond the more natural and simple associative processes of an object or an image and its sound. Yeah. Yep. And so what I'm hearing you say is that you've been working to establish this kind of fundamental foundational understanding of the interrelationship of skills that are involved in the kind of oral to written language interface.
Yes.
And that you've been able to kind of, map that out in some way and say these things are general.
Yes.
And then they particularize as you get into the differences in the oral languages and in the orthographies.
Yes.
And so what else do you think we should talk about at that general foundational level before we go on to particularize?
Well, maybe just to understand also the role of speed in word recognition, because that has been in cross-linguistic literature, whenever comparisons have been made with English, the one big distinguishing factor has been that among learners of relatively regular writing systems, really the factor that you have to look at, the thing that distinguishes good readers from poor readers, is reading speed, whereas in English it tends to be accuracy. And I would say that that's one other sort of universal that maybe that's not quite accurate, in that the fact is that once English children master word recognition to some reasonable degree of fluency, of course, the appropriate measure again becomes speed. So it's again a question of how you measure things that enable you to make these sorts of generalizations about what's language specific and what's universal. Really, when you compare like with like, when you're comparing kids who decode to a similar level of proficiency or accuracy, speed plays a similar role as well. So, for example, when we work with adult dyslexics, in particular in university contexts, very often these are people who can read quite accurately, although they clearly have a diagnosis of dyslexia, and they're perhaps reading and spelling at a level lower than would be expected, and so on. But where they begin to look like readers of these more transparent orthographies is that if you give them anything that requires speeded responses, decoding, phonological awareness, phonological processing tasks, they are massively impaired in speed.
Right.
So I would say that that's one other.
Let's talk about speed just a little bit. Is there a relationship between the pace of spoken language and the speed of reading? In other words, it seems to me that the oral language, the speed at which words whiz by in the oral language world, creates a kind of temporal profile for comprehension, and that reading has to generate the virtual word stream at a pace that's similar to that oral language rate, in order for it to be friendly and compatible with the way that brain has learned to comprehend language.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how does speed relate to what I just said, or does it?
I'm not really sure. I don't know, and I wouldn't know whether you would get sort of discrepancies between good readers and poor readers. Certainly when you speed up speech and ask people to do tasks of any kind at the phonetic level or phonological level or comprehension, performance is impaired. So if you present people with language at a speed that is higher than is normal, performance does go down.
Or if you go too slow, they can't stay in their attention. When I do these little talks, I actually take a 10-second clip of a very famous song, and I speed it at 3 times and 1/3 speed. And at 1/3 speed, it drags so much nobody can recognize it. And at 3 times, it's beyond recognition. So
right.
there is a temporal profile
yes.
of language processing that reading's got to approximate if
yes.
the comprehension circuitry on the other side of both is really going to function while it would seem.
Yep. Yes, I think that must be true. But are you asking whether there are cross-linguistic differences in that? Whether speakers of some language would be used to hearing?
I would imagine there's slight variations, but that it would be less about cross-linguistic and more about interlinguistic, in the sense that whatever is the rate of the oral language in the language that's native to that person, that reading has to output an approximation to that temporal profile in order for that orthography and that oral language to work well together and taking off there.
Yes, yes. Yep, I'd say that's probably true.
Okay. And so when you talk about speed, where you're going with speed, is there a correspondence between that conversation and what we've just been, toying with here?
Well, yes, in the sense that people with dyslexia or reading difficulties tend to, once they overcome the accuracy deficits, tend to remain very slow at all of these word recognition and related types of skills. And so, yes, that jives with what you were just saying. The idea is that, well, if your processing of print or of the sound structure that print maps onto is so slow, then sure, that will affect not only your reading and the actual fluency of what you read, but probably your comprehension of that as well.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so you were talking about, I didn't want to distract us, but when you said speed, that's what triggers in me, is that conversation. I'm very interested in, because I keep seeing with the children that I observe and that I've recorded and watched and videotaped and seen the stuttering processing in, that something's bogging them down in the processing, and and that has a direct it has a radiant effect on everything.
Yes.
So back to the platform we were at. Before we go on, I'm enjoying this, so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about this.
It's a pleasure.
Did you ever encounter Zia Bresnitz's work?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I've read some of it, yeah.
Okay, all right, yeah, because there's some parallels in the space here, too. Okay, what else should we say about these foundations that you've managed to shine light on? We talked about speed, we've talked about the reciprocal effects of reading and spelling, the symmetry or resonance, dissonance between oral language structure and orthography. What are some of the other things that we could say that are universal before we go on to differentiate the differences?
I don't know. Well, maybe we've covered the main ones, I would say.
Well, I mean, you're closer to this than I am, for sure. So if there's something you think that we're not talking about that we should...
Yeah, no. I'd say those are them. That, the foundations, I'd say, are universal, definitely within alphabetic writing systems. And the role of the developing skills and the role of speed, I'd say those are the key ones.
Okay. So then we get into the if we could say that this is a core, these are the core components that are involved in the challenge of becoming literate, right? Mm-hmm. And then that challenge gets exacerbated by the differences in the oral language structure, mm-hmm. and how those differences correspond, complement, or create difficulties in the correspondence with the structure in the orthography. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Can we move to that stage now?
Yes.
All right. So what aspect of the structure of oral language, putting aside orthography temporarily, mm-hmm. do you think it's important to understand in order to move towards this cross-linguistic differentiation?
Well, I think there are definitely elements that have to do with the phonology, so things like the syllable structure of a language. Mm-hmm. That certainly seems to affect children's ability to access and become aware of various sublexical units for phonological processing. So things like how frequent are consonant clusters in a language, and how frequently can they occur at the beginning of a word, of a syllable or a word, or at the end. How varied are they allowed to be in a language? I think all of those kinds of things are important. So the phonotactic kinds of factors.
So impositions on sound combinations.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and
that are inherent to the language environment that they've developed in.
Yes, definitely, because these are dimensions along which languages can vary quite dramatically, and one reason why Czech was a good comparison language for comparison with English was because, for example, Czech is quite unusual in that it allows very large clusters to occur at the beginnings of words, so several consonants, and in a very wide range of combinations, many of which would be completely illegal in English, would be unpronounceable in English. Mm-hmm. And so the argument is that, well, if you have from birth experience with, and you have to learn to actually pronounce these kinds of sequences well enough to be understood in your language, then perhaps that sort of sensitizes you to, or possibly in some way focuses you more on those particular aspects, those things that play a heavy functional role in the language.
You could, to use the analog from the machine world, you could almost say that it formats your processing in a certain way.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, and that isn't entirely, you wouldn't necessarily logically come to that conclusion, because you could argue, well, the more frequent that certain larger chunks are in your language, maybe the more prone you will become to treating them as units. But it seems that really it's both the frequency and the amount of variability of what kinds of sounds are allowed to alternate with what other sounds that plays a pretty important role. So I'd say that's one thing, mm-hmm. phonotactics. And the other big one that I think we really haven't paid very much attention to yet, but I think that's coming, is really the role of prosody. And of stress, and I think that for English-speaking children, that really is not a trivial component, a trivial part of the, this thing about ambiguity, mm-hmm. between in the mappings, has a lot to do with the fact that we have reduced vowels. We have unstressed syllables and stressed syllables, and it tends to be the unstressed ones where you end up with this ambiguous schwa sound for a vowel, and mapping vowel sounds, vowel letters to those schwa bits. That is probably the most ambiguous part of the mapping challenge. So in that sense, there are languages that have open syllable structure, which means they don't have consonants at the end. They tend to have consonant vowel sequences. So they're perceptually quite clearly defined because you're opening and closing the jaw.
You've got more distinct unitization.
Yes, yes. The vowels in some languages, you don't have this sort of alternating stress, so there's much less vowel reduction. For example, in French, even though French has a complex orthography, it has much less reduction. It has fixed stress, on the final syllable, even though people...
And all these variabilities compound into ambiguity.
Yes, yes. So it's not just about how many letters can map onto a single sound, but it's the other way around as well. And why are some sounds mapping onto different letters?
Right. And historically, just as an aside, a kind of parenthetical here, is the relationship between the spelling and the sound system and the pronunciation and the stress and how they co-evolved. It just fascinates me.
It is very interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and that if there wasn't such correspondence confusion in the way the orthography began and developed, then there would be entirely different spelling consistencies. And then if there was different spelling consistencies, how would that affect our pronunciation and use?
Yes.
How would that affect how we learn to stress different? I mean, this is all interacting in a really complex way.
Very complex. Very true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're quite a far way, along in understanding it, but really not. We're not nearly there, I don't think.
Yeah, yeah. What I just keep getting amazed with is that we've created situations in which these children, when they're 5 and 6 years old, faced with the kinds of confusions that we're describing and we're talking about, feel like being confused is a reflection of something wrong with them. That we could let that go on is very centrally what upsets me. Anyway, so we just went through some of the other steps away from the general foundational stuff into the differentiation, and you were talking about the stress. Yeah. So what else can we add into that space?
Well, then there are things about how the languages are structured morphologically. I think that is another kind of layer that can help to disambiguate or make more ambiguous the orthography. So, for example, in inflected languages, like the Slavic languages, for example, you tend to have consistency both phonologically and orthographically in the spellings between the stem spelling and the stem pronunciation, the root of a word or the main part of a word, and the inflected bits at the beginning or at the end, sometimes in the middles of words. And it's really one reason why it's relatively easier for Slavic languages, for example, to remain relatively transparent is because of this, is because of the way that the language combines morphemes into meaningful word units. Whereas in English you have all of this trade-off between the morphology of a word and the phonology of that word, and the fact that we retain the spelling to reflect the morphological value of the word, and trade that off against its pronunciation or the phonological values. So that's, I'd say, another
layer of complexity. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
And another way in which languages, another reason why languages might be easier or more difficult to learn. But on the other hand, even in these more transparent systems, I think one thing that people sort of tend to underestimate is the complexity of learning even in these more transparent systems. You know, even though kids can learn the most basic skills more quickly, there tend to be other aspects of the language system that complicate the way that written language represents it. And so very often, I'd say, well, in most European languages, it's not as though kids are fully literate, let's say, by the end of grade 1 or by the end of grade 2. They also will have a lot more to learn because there will be some subtle confusions or inconsistencies, but that
the challenges are distributed differently. Yeah, right. I once asked Reed Lyon, because people throw around comparisons of how well different countries are reading and so forth, and I said, well, how can we derive value from these international comparisons if we can't, if we don't have a sufficient granularity in the frameworks of what we're comparing? To be able to look at all the different distinctly language-specific challenges across the spectrum, from learning to speak it to becoming masterful with its orthography. If we don't have a map of those different distinct language-specific challenge components, how do we cross-compare them?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and that's a very, very big point. It's very, very difficult. I mean, at some level, probably where it is easiest to make these cross-language comparisons is in these very early stages, the foundation stage, because you can take an alphabetic system and say, okay, at the very beginning, at the very least, probably kids need to have A and B, possibly C. But beyond that, it's quite true. There are these real methodological big issues that have to do with, well, how can you compare even reading comprehension across languages? Now, I'm sure that eventually we will figure out a fairly reliable way to do it, but we really don't have the tools yet to make possibly valid.
Yes, and yet the comparisons that we do have enormous political force in how we allocate how important we see literacy is. I mean, the fact that we rank ourselves in such and such numbers says, well, we're not so bad, and which has always just seemed absurd to me. Not to get lost on that, but soon we passed by that space, it triggered me.
Yeah, no, that's a very important issue, and I think that has to be a really big part of the agenda of cross-language researchers, and I think it is developing tools really for measuring like with like, and
which implicitly the tools have to overlay on a framework that identifies everything we can about the distinctly different components of challenges across these things, because we can't know. Take, for example, the obvious thing, which we want to get to more later, of the extra years of labor that is often associated with learning English, right? What can we say about what that's costing us? What difficulties are associated with that? How we stack up, so to speak, which again I'm not that interested in. I'm more interested in the overall relationship between humans as an organism and code, as a writing system, and about the kind of suffering that children are going through than I am in how one country competes with another country on reading scores. But we don't have a basis to say if we're spending, X percentage of the GNP on literacy-related instruction in a country. We can't cross-compare that expenditure versus performance with another country if we don't have a framework that that details out the differences of the challenges involved. It just seems, absurd.
Yeah, I think that's right. Really, these kinds of comparisons for the time being are really best used to reveal,
what we don't know.
Scientific tools, exactly. Yeah.
They kind of tell us what we don't know more than what we do know, but yet the politicians are running amok with them like they tell us something important about what we do know. Okay, well, let's not get lost on that rabbit hole.
Okay.
So what else can we say at the oral language level of what's differentiating the challenges? Before we move to orthography.
I'd say probably, the ones I can think of offhand are these, definitely the phonological structure at the word reading level, that certainly seems to have an impact. Prosody, morphology, how words are formed in languages, and presumably also syntax at some higher level, but I'd say at the word reading level, or at the
where these variations in oral languages are modulating, affecting the challenge of getting into the getting through the orthography.
Yes.
Right, and what we're saying is that consistency versus variability and complexity and variability on these dimensions are all part of what's regulating the challenge of taking off in literacy.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. And so now we come to if we're ready for it.
Yes.
And by the way, I never asked for a particular body of time. I never blocked out the time. So if we're intruding on your time boundary, I would like to keep going, but I can also say let's come to whatever stop we've got to make in order to make your next meeting or whatever today work for you. And I'd love to continue if that's what we got to do.
Okay, well, I'm actually at work and have office hours in 20 minutes.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. Okay.
Yeah.
So do you want to try to squeeze in orthography in 20 minutes, or do you want to have a part two?
Let's give it a try.
Okay.
Let's give it a try, and if there's lots more to say in 20 minutes' time, then maybe we could continue. It's just that here it's getting to the end of the day, and I have to do another hour after this.
Sure. That's why I'm bringing it up right now, so that we didn't run out of time and not even will be aware of it.
We either have to continue. Probably like tomorrow or something.
That's fine. Whatever works for you. I really appreciate this conversation.
You're breaking up a little bit.
Am I? How's that now?
I can't hear you very well now.
Huh. I'm sorry. Let me see what's going on with the rig here, if it's something on the equipment level.
Okay. Yeah, that's probably, no. There's static on the line.
Huh. Let me see. Let me switch phones just in case we're wearing out the battery on this one.
Okay.
How's that?
Yep.
Is that better?
Yep.
All right, good. Then we'll finish with this way.
Okay.
See, we need a certain amount of power to keep the system coherent, huh?
Right.
So, the variations that we've been talking about so far, the oral language variations in prosody and morphology and syntax and phonology in general, those are variations that are being picked up as the child learns and differentiates themselves into the language environment they're growing up in. Yeah?
Yep.
And in that sense, it's a gradual process over many years that's really charged with meaning, because it's the core of their life, of being able to communicate with the important people around them. So it's highly charged with meaning. It's a natural extension of language. It's the differentiation of language in their unique language environment. And after or on top of those variations, we have another kind of variation which is coming in at the orthography level, which doesn't have the same kind of structure to it. I mean, it's not as richly meaningful, at least initially. It's not as natural and engaging as another human being. And the kind of confusions that are in it are not the consequence of the coevolution of language and culture working out the, these variations in the oral language structure. They're consequences of an entirely different order and kind, having more to do with, technology and negligence and things like that, and historical accident. And so it's an entirely different field to have to function in. Yeah? And these correspondences, these differences in the orthography, exacerbate all the other challenges. Yeah? Are we safe so far?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So what else could we say about two things? What else are the features of orthography that you think are most important to understand with respect to what's exacerbating the challenge in one orthography that's deeper than another? And kind of apart from that, what is the whatever you want to say, I guess, about from that point about the orthographic depth hypothesis and your thoughts about it. Well, let's just go in that direction, I guess.
Okay. Well, the most obvious one, I guess, within alphabetic writing systems, the factor that distinguishes these transparent from in deep or opaque systems is this inconsistency, right, in the mappings between letters and phonemes. So the extent to which a language allows multiple correspondences from print to sound and from sound to print, that makes it more opaque, more ambiguous, and makes it a more difficult system to learn, at least in the fundamental coding aspects of it. So to the extent to which it allows multiple correspondences, that's one thing. And then I guess another factor would be just the number of units that it uses as these core functional units, the minimal elements that are allowed to combine in the orthography. And I guess within alphabetic writing systems, that's actually quite similar. I mean, there is variation between languages, but it's nothing like the variation that you get between, let's say, English, the graphemes in English and the characters in Chinese.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's based on combinatoric assembly rather than isolated representation.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So, but do you make a distinction between, let's say we've got 45 phonemes and 26 letters, in English.
Sorry, you're now, it's really staticky.
Yeah.
And I hear sort of every other syllable.
Huh. I'm sorry. What? I don't know what's going on with that.
Yeah, I'm just jiggling my cord here in case it's my phone, but I don't think it is.
I can do one of two things. I can either we can stop and pick this up tomorrow, like we were going to, like we talked about, or we can stop and I can try to call again. Maybe we've got a deteriorated line, in the multiplex of connections between our phones.
Yeah.
Because I don't think both of these phones, I don't think they're the problem.
Can you hear me normally?
I can hear you pretty well. I can hear a little bit.
Hear any static?
I hear a little bit, but nothing that keeps me from making your sound intelligible.
Yeah, no, okay. You're, it's as if you were going through a tunnel on a train.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
So should I try to call you back now, or do you want to reschedule?
Well, I have 5 minutes, which is maybe pushing it a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I could give you another number to reach me on tomorrow then.
Okay.
And it could be, could we make it like an hour earlier, 2 o'clock?
Yes.
My time?
Yep.
So, okay. So it's 0151, sorry, 44, you know, UK.
Yeah, 44.
And then, in fact, it's 151 because you're dialing long distance. 737.
Okay.
2926.
2926.
Yeah.
So 44, 151, 737, 2926.
Yes.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. I look forward to continuing tomorrow.
Okay, then. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. All right. Well, I really enjoyed yesterday's conversation, and I think it brought us right to the edge of where we need to be.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm most interested now, having gone through some of the, oral language processing, some of the things that are general attributes of reading regardless of orthography or language, and we kind of worked our way right up to the orthography.
Yes.
And what I want to do now is to talk about the research that you've done and the research that you're aware of and have commented upon that speaks to the correlation between orthographic depth and reading difficulties and general, and then specifically in English.
Okay. So do you want me to just maybe go over that concept of
yes, please.
The orthographic depth hypothesis?
Yes, please.
Okay. So, well, this is a theory that has the basic claim that the depth of the orthography determines or affects the kinds of processes that people will rely on in recognizing words. And these effects can be manifested in different ways, but in fact probably the way that the orthography affects processing is subconscious. You know, these differences wouldn't be obvious to the reader. And I guess an important thing about it is that it's really a theory that was devised to account for skilled reading and to between language differences in skilled reading. It wasn't really a developmental theory in the same way that the dual root model, for example, isn't really a developmental theory, but we'll get to that maybe later.
Okay.
But anyway, so how exactly the depth might affect the processing does depend on the kind of theoretical perspective that one has. So in dual root, for example, the dual root model kind of assumes that there are at least 2 and maybe 3 possible pathways that can be adopted to recognize words. And one pathway is this phonological pathway in which the reader would see a string of letters that make up a word and would actually try to serially decode that word. So every letter sound correspondence would be activated, those sounds would be assembled, and only then would the word be recognized. So phonology in this phonological assembly route is like a mediating factor to recognition.
So the code is cueing the assembly of sound.
Yes. Yes. And the other routes would be more direct routes that actually bypass phonology in the recognition process, and phonology would only be activated after the fact. So, for example, one of the routes would go via semantics. So if you saw the string of letters, that you wouldn't then compute the phonology of it, but immediately access its meaning. recognize it, and only after that word has been recognized would you then produce some sort of output phonology, some sort of pronunciation for that word.
Right, and here again it's critical to remember your caveat in the beginning that this wasn't so much developmental as explaining how a good reader reads, yeah?
Yes, very much so.
Because in the developmental phase, you couldn't do the latter part of the dual route you just talked about as well, obviously.
Quite, yes.
Okay, so when we talk about learning to read and struggling, children that are struggling to learn to read, the dual route hypothesis is less relevant than to our descriptions of what's happening to somebody who's a more developed reader.
Yes. So, well, I'd say that that phonological assembly route is definitely the more relevant one for beginners.
Yes.
And, well, there are arguments about what poor older readers do. So there are these there are claims that we have subtypes of people with dyslexia, for example, and some actually tend to rely on that assembly route even when it isn't efficient to do so. That's the argument. And so they tend to laboriously decode letter by letter and produce, try to recognize words, and this is sometimes efficient and sometimes isn't. Whereas other types of dyslexics, presumably, are quite good at memorizing these whole word pattern and pronunciation correspondences. So they're what you might call whole word readers. But if you give them a non-word to read or a low frequency word, then their reading falls apart because they can't actually rely on that phonological assembly route.
Which has a parallel to the whole fourth grade hit the wall thing that happened to whole language in general. Yeah. Okay. So I think we're tracking. I didn't mean to distract you. I just wanted to make sure we grounded that point really well.
Yes. Yeah. So, but in terms of between language differences, the claim of a route like the dual route theory was that, well, if you're a reader of a consistent orthography, a transparent one, then you would really only ever need to develop that phonological assembly route, and you would never have any incentive to try to recognize words directly as wholes and to access their meaning before you actually try to access a pronunciation. Whereas if you were a reader of a system like English, for example, that alternative would be a very efficient way for you to recognize irregular words and exception words and so on in the language. So that's really the one explanation of the dual root explanation of what might explain differences between how readers of different orthography process words or recognize words.
You could say that for many readers, the process starts off as the phonologically oriented approach, and it is through that they develop the whole word recognition, that once they've identified a word a sufficient number of times, they recognize it as a whole, but not because they were trained to recognize the word as a whole in isolation, but because they learned to work it out. Right, so that ultimately the phonological route process primes the process of being able to recognize whole words and then transcends the sound loop.
Yes, well, sure. So that's one possible explanation. But in fact, there are other theories that would argue that even when you learn to read these irregular words very accurately, you're actually always going through phonology. So phonology is always the mediating factor. And one of these theories is called the strong phonological theory, and that's Ram Frost's theory, and which I think, well, I'm quite partial to. And so he argues that, it doesn't matter, regardless of the orthography that you're reading, or at least in alphabetic systems, you're always trying to compute. Your default strategy or process is to try to map phonology to the orthography, and then through that recognize the word. But what matters, or how depth does affect that process, is in how effective that output is. So if you're reading a transparent orthography, then that will work quite efficiently. You can process on a grapheme or letter by letter basis, let's say, map letters to phonemes and produce quite a well-specified, accurate representation of that target word.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're an English reader, for example, then chances are that quite often that what you come up with through just the phonological process will only be partially accurate. It will approximate the target, but it won't fully specify the word. And so in that case, you need to rely after the fact. So once you've computed some kind of phonological representation, then you need to access the other things you know about the word, or the possible words, like the meaning of the word and the full spelling of a word, and so on.
So it's not so exclusive a route. It's kind of tickling a co-implication of other parallel possible ways of recognizing the word that all converge into something that is behind word recognition.
Yes, yes. And so he's arguing that really that the default strategy, the thing that you need to do as your eyes spot a word, is to initially try to figure out a pronunciation or a phonological representation, and then how much your other resources, your other bits of knowledge about words in the language come in to aid that process. That is determined by the orthographic depth.
Right. Okay. Good. That's a good, helpful frame.
Yeah, I think that's a very plausible explanation. I guess I should add also that he then argues that whereas in these transparent orthographies you can quite reliably depend on phoneme-grapheme correspondences to access phonological representations. In less consistent orthographies, you might want to learn to compute larger, what are called grain sizes, right? These larger sized units of phonology to orthography mapping. So that's one other difference.
So that now we're talking about recognizing the distinct sounds associated with clusters rather than individual letters.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And particularly true in the case of English, where the orthography, where the number of letters is insufficient to represent the number of phonemes, and they have to be pair bonded in idiosyncratic ways in order to cover the range of sounds.
Yes. Yes. That's it.
Good. So what evidence do we have from a research point of view? I mean, coming back at this from the perspective that most interests me, is that it seems to me that there's in the reading researchers that I've talked to, a marked quality of struggling readers is the hesitant, start-stop, labored approach to working out word recognition. And that when you deconstruct what's involved in that labor, in that hesitating, starting, stopping process that seems to characterize so many struggling readers, it seems as if they're occupied with working out the correspondence between letters and sounds.
Yeah.
And that therefore we could say that the orthography is, from a pure processing ecology, less efficient, and it's creating more kind of brain work dissipation in order to get to recognition, which is radiating through the entire process of speed, fluency, comprehension. Everything is kind of stuttering over the
core processing delays and inefficiencies associated with the difficulty of working out the correspondences.
Yes. Well, that's right. That's sort of one of the central difficulties of becoming a fluent reader in English. Certainly is learning not just the core correspondences, those canonical, initial letter sound correspondences, but all of those other variations that the language allows, definitely. And I guess another difficulty that poor readers have, and that good readers possess, is this ability to actually notice, even if, or I should say, a sensitivity to, because they might not explicitly notice, but be sensitive to the larger context than the letter.
Right.
Even when that isn't, and in the sense of being able to use the statistical sort of distributional properties, the knowledge that you have about what kinds of letters tend to co-occur with what other letters in pronouncing, in specifying a pronunciation. And poor readers tend not to be as aware of those kinds of distributional properties.
Right, and this interacts all the way down into the kind of interactive compensational models that the more time that the brain is spending on the lower level decodings, the less kind of bandwidth there is for the comprehension overall that could be tickling the reduction of confusion at the decoding level.
Yes.
Yeah. So all of this plays itself out. First of all, it's just amazing to me, and I have some explanations that we've developed, based on the history of orthography and various attempts to try to bring the spelling and sound into better correspondence, and the kind of stink and smear that got put over people that ever tried to do that, and therefore the reluctance in the community to, I've actually had conversations with some of the leading scientists in this field who are overtly and even own up to the fact that they're afraid to talk about the inconsistencies in the code and its relationship to learning to read for fear that it leads to the whole language argument.
Oh, I see.
So there's actually a political, social, psychological, scientific community bias against a kind of hard science understanding, at least in some of the circles I've talked to, about the correspondence between the orthographic inconsistency and variability and context dependency and so forth, and reading difficulties, because they don't want to go there, because the assumption is, well, the only thing you could do that would change that would be to change the code, and we're not going to do that, so therefore we shouldn't be thinking about that. Which is kind of bizarre when you consider how many people are affected by this.
True. True, but I guess there's also the argument that it's not really entirely predictable what changing, like simplifying the code would do. How that would affect, whether that would complicate things in other ways.
But then now you get strategy specific, right? You'd have to test out any particular strategy. I'm not trying to advocate simplifying the code in the sense that changing the alphabet, changing the spelling, or any of the historical things. I just think that it's kind of the Sufi key story to not be looking harder at those dimensions of this that are exacerbating the core challenge of reading, that are a consequence of the orthography, which is a technology which has had an entirely different process of development than cultural evolution and linguistic things and so forth. And that, again, as I said yesterday, the thing that really concerns me is that the context of the experience of struggling readers is that they perceive their struggle as reflective of something wrong with themselves. And in order to blow up that myth, I think we've got to take on the code in a different way.
Yes.
All right, so having said that, and I don't mean to lead you down the path on that, other than just to give you some context for where I'm trying to drill here,
Tell me about the comparative language research, literacy learning research that you're aware of and have done that shine a light from a more empirical, even if statistical point of view on how orthography, variations in the complexity and depth of orthography relate to the difficulty of learning to read.
Well, I can sort of offhand, like in this context of orthographic depth and processing differences and so on, think of a few studies that have been actually done quite recently between comparing German and English-speaking children. And these studies are actually quite nice because the languages have a common root, and so you can find quite a number of these cognate words, so words that have the same spelling and the same meaning and a very similar pronunciation.
Because of their sharing of the same Latin substructure?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so in these studies, these have been done, well, most recently by Joe Ziegler and Usha Goswami and their colleagues. They have shown that when you ask English-speaking children and German-speaking children to read these same words, essentially, that the kids, the German-speaking children, tend to be, again, more tied to the phonological recoding, that phonological assembly route, or something akin to that. And that they seem to be processing on a phoneme-grapheme level, whereas English speakers tend to show evidence, anyways, of processing larger units. And they argue that these are onset rhyme about sized units. So that there is some indication that even among children, although how early that those differences actually sort of kick in, that's not really clearly established yet. But probably by second or third grade, you do get these processing differences. So by about second grade, good English readers need to be able to, or tend to be able to process print in larger chunks, and that seems to be beneficial. And in a recent study by Ziegler and his colleagues, where they actually included dyslexic samples, they found that the English dyslexic kids were, of course, relatively delayed, and they were slower readers and so on, but that they tended to stick to behave like the German readers in that sense, or basically to be showing probably earlier strategies. So they weren't showing effects of this kind of larger unit processing. They were still very much affected by how many letters actually comprised the word, and the more letters, the slower and less accurate they became. So they were clearly processing. So
somehow they couldn't get past the phonological process to start to consider additional routes of parallel processing to tickle that word recognition.
Possibly, or they just couldn't begin to just compute, even at a sublexical level, could not progress to the stage of mapping larger units to larger orthographic units to larger phonological units. They just stayed at this, what we were talking about earlier, this sort of letter by letter, sound by sound sort of process where they couldn't access the other kinds of information, higher level information that might help them to recognize the words. So that's one bit of evidence. Then there's just plenty of evidence to show that so from some work that I've done with comparing Czech and English-speaking children, dyslexic groups and controls and so on, that the children who, within their own context, so for example, Czech dyslexic children, even though within their context they're showing very large delays, long delays, their overall performance is higher relative to English-speaking children if you give them the same types of tasks. So word-level decoding, word-level spelling, phonological awareness tasks, and so on. So there does seem to be some sort of additional cost that English poor readers suffer over and above whatever they would suffer, if they were functioning in a transparent system.
Right.
So they show very similar patterns. Their profiles actually aren't all that different, but there is this absolute difference in just the level of performance that they reach given a particular age.
Which has less to do with differences, which we're saying has consequences because of the different challenges the orthography represents.
Yes.
Yeah?
I would say that's got to be true.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the work involved in solving for word recognition, the more complex the orthography, the more work involved. And the work takes time.
Yes.
And time we don't have much of if we're going to get to word recognition at a rate sufficient to sustain the flow of meaning. Yeah, so all these things are connected?
Yes. I'd say so.
So what haven't we talked about that you think would be helpful for people to understand about how the depth of orthography exacerbates the challenges inherent in this unnatural process called reading?
I'm not sure how much we haven't covered. I think we've covered quite a lot. But I guess, well...
What question haven't I asked you? I mean, I think that most of the questions that I had, and I've just been trying to be respectful of our time limitation, just coming up fast. I think our dialogue has kind of woven in the questions that I was most interested in, and I think the questions that you wanted added as well.
Yes.
And if there's anything that we haven't covered that you think is important, I just want to give us some time to talk about that.
Well, I think one thing, you asked me what I thought teachers or other practitioners might not really appreciate or quite understand about the effects of orthographic depth. And I guess I'd say, well, there are probably several things, but one that I encounter even now with teacher friends and lay people certainly is this idea that if you're learning a more inconsistent system, then you do rely on different cognitive processes. So, for example, readers of inconsistent systems probably rely more on visual processes. And reading is more about visual memory and visual discrimination and so on, and relies less on these linguistic structures. And so I guess that would be an important thing to emphasize, that really based on all the evidence we have so far, including really different types of systems like Chinese, we really have very little evidence that even in deep systems, people rely on visual skills, so let's say memorization of whole words, more than readers of transparent systems. So if you look at how well things like visual memory or visual discrimination tasks correlate with word reading across languages, you certainly don't find stronger correlations, let's say, with Chinese or English readers than you might with Czech readers. In fact, they tend not to correlate, or only very weakly anyway. Whereas what we do find is that when you look at the role of phonological processing, morphological processing, these sublexical types of processes, those do correlate, and they do account for variability in people's performance. So I think that would be...
I would think that's great. That's really an important addition. And building on that, it seems that the kind of cognitive exercise and the kind of cognitive infrastructure in terms of the number of different processes that have to concur and co-implicate, that the exercise environment of a deeper orthography and what that brings about in terms of cognitive processing kind of infrastructure would be different.
Mm-hmm.
And that there would be, for those that get through the process, I would think that would provide some cognitive advantages in terms of speed of abstract processing, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But that for people that don't, I mean, the need for having that kind of extra complex, abstract, visually involved cognitive processes is just another whole layer of challenge.
Yes. Yep. Yes. Good.
All right. Well, this is wonderful. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and it fits into a nice slot in the overall system that we're trying. Again, I mean, our main concern is to help people detoxify. One of the things that we're really interested in is when, just as bandwidth is short, bandwidth is so critical to all this processing. What happens when somebody's going into self-consciousness about their emotional response to the confusion here? I mean, that's just bandwidth draining big time.
Yes.
And that's how so from our point of view, a lot of struggling readers, once they get to a point where, because they blame themselves for the confusion, they start to have an emotional aversion to this. The emotional aversion is now exacerbating this challenge to such a degree that it is as critical as the cognitive dimensions and the orthographic dimensions in terms of things we got to deal with if we're going to help them.
Yes, very true. And so I guess being aware of all the components that we can make explicit to them, if they can't just come by them on their own, and figuring out which ones are the most teachable and most effective components, that might help them.
Right. We've got to become neurologically very efficient, given where they're coming from, and we've got to reframe the context of the confusion and the experience of the confusion so as to reduce their propensity to go into self-blame and develop a cognitive shunting, concurrent emotional process.
Yep. Yes.
Okay, well, we're up on our time, and I do want to respect it, and I'm so grateful for you. Thank you so much for your time.
It was a pleasure.
Okay, my pleasure, too. I hope that our paths will cross again. Perhaps they will someday.
Okay, I hope so, too.
If you come to the United States, let me know, because I'd love to, get you in front of a camera and do some more of this.
Okay.
All right?
All right.
Thank you much.
So can you just, one last thing is...
of course.
You will send me...
a transcript of this conversation.
Transcript, and I can sort of proofread and... You
can proofread it, yeah. I mean, I want to make sure that we don't lose the meaning, but exactly, yeah. And one other thing you could do for me, if you can, is to send me a picture.
Okay.
Okay? I mean, there's the one on your website, but I'd prefer one a little bigger than that if you could send me one.
Okay.
Okay?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, and good luck to everything you're doing.
Oh, thanks very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.